We concluded the previous episode on the Smalcald articles, recalling Luther's scathing remarks about the Mass.
Right. And what's especially important about Luther's views was how well he understood the interconnections between what was happening in the day-to-day ministry of the churches and erroneous theological underpinnings. Specifically, he knew it all came down to the doctrine of justification by faith, as it's rooted in the distinction between the law and the gospel.
As you heard in the first episode on the Smalcald articles, Luther did not hold back in his critique of the Mass and all of its ancillary teachings and practices.
And Luther addressed another of those ancillary practices in a very brief third article. In that article, Luther demanded that the Roman Catholic communities, such as foundations, which were associations of secular priests, and monasteries, needed to be returned to their original purpose, namely for education. He wanted to use them to educate and train more preachers, church workers, and other necessary earthly government service, even including training women to be the heads of the household.
In other words, Luther wanted the foundations and former monasteries to be used to train people for a variety of vocations. If that didn't happen, said Luther, they should be torn down rather than be used for religious inventions of false piety.
Let's do a quick sidebar here on how this relates to justification by faith alone and a misunderstanding of the function and use of the law.
Sure. Go ahead, lawyer.
It relates to the issue of false piety. False piety is rooted in a misunderstanding of the uses of the law. Luther recognized that justification by faith alone is apart from righteousness in the law. Monasteries and other such abuses function much like what Paul was dealing with in his letter to the Galatians. Recall, after hearing the gospel, religious leaders in Galatia came in and tried to insert spiritual disciplines and admonitions as part and parcel to Christian righteousness.
Essentially, making the law your guide for righteousness, again after being claimed by Christ?
Exactly.
That helps to explain what we read in the second article.
Yes, it does. When there's a fundamental disconnect regarding the distinction between the law and the gospel, and thus justification by faith alone, it reverberates through everything.
This is why when you turn to the fourth article, it's abundantly clear that Luther had no intention of giving even a sliver of hope that Lutherans and the papacy would be reconciled.
In this article, Luther takes up the issue that originally put him in the crosshairs of the Pope, namely, Luther's assertion that the Pope is not the head of all Christendom by divine right, because that belongs only to Jesus Christ himself.
In other words, Luther recognized that the Pope is simply a bishop or pastor who serves alongside other Christians, but who has no higher Christian status than any other Christian.
Not surprisingly, Luther had strong feelings about this issue of the authority and status of the Pope. He notes there was no Pope in the first 500 years of the Christian Church, and that there are many Christian churches, including the Greek Church, that have never been under the Pope.
Even further, Luther wrote that the Pope, quote, is the true end times Antichrist, who has raised himself over and set himself against Christ, because the Pope will not let Christians be saved without his authority, which amounts to nothing since it is not ordered or commanded by God, end quote.
Put simply, Luther recognized that the Roman Catholic teachings replace Jesus with the Pope.
As a concluding remark to this second section of the Smalcald articles, it's clear Luther had no hope of an ecumenical relationship with the papacy.
To illustrate the point, let me read to you what Luther wrote. Quote, "At the council, we will not stand, as happened at Augsburg, before the emperor or the secular authority, which issued a most gracious summons and allowed matters to be heard in a fair manner. We will stand before the Pope and the devil himself, who does not intend to listen, but only to damn us on the spot, to murder us, and to force us into idolatry. Therefore, here we must not kiss his feet or say, 'You are my gracious Lord.' Rather, we ought to speak as the angel spoke to the devil in Zechariah, 'The Lord rebuke you, O Satan.'" End quote.
Recognizing the deep divisions between the Lutherans and the papacy, rooted in the fundamental difference in doctrine, the third section of the Smalcald articles lays bare a Lutheran understanding of the Christian faith and teaching with no holds barred.